On February 28, a blockade began, and some economists now say it may end up hurting the country that started it. Here is the problem. A naval blockade sounds decisive. Cut off the exports, starve the economy, force a surrender. That is the theory. But Iran has faced isolation before. In 1953, the United States and United Kingdom imposed a similar blockade. It lasted years. The regime did not collapse. It took a covert operation and $3 million in CIA funding to finally force a change. That was 70 years ago. Today, some analysts argue, Iran is far more prepared. The country views this confrontation as existential, not a negotiation, not a trade dispute, a fight for survival. And nations fighting for survival do not fold under economic pressure. They absorb it, they adapt, they wait. Critics of the current strategy suggest the blockade may actually strengthen Iran's position. The longer it holds out, the more leverage it gains, and the more pressure builds somewhere else entirely, on American consumers. This is the part most overlooked. Iran is not a small player in global oil markets. When its exports disappear, supply tightens. When supply tightens, prices rise. And when prices rise, American families feel it at the pump, at the grocery store, in their heating bills. Some economists warn this is already happening. Others contend the effect has been overstated. But there is little debate that prolonged disruption to Middle Eastern oil carries real risk. One view holds that the United States actually needs Iranian oil flowing to prevent a broader economic shock. Not because it buys that oil directly, but because global markets are interconnected. Remove a major supplier, and the entire system rebalances, usually upward, and rising energy costs do not stay contained. They ripple through transportation, manufacturing, food production. They show up in inflation numbers. They show up in approval ratings. Recent polling suggests only 1 in 3 Americans currently support this conflict. That is 33%, a minority. And some political observers argue that number could fall further if economic pain intensifies. Here is what makes this different from previous foreign engagements. The cost is not abstract. It is not measured in distant casualties or diplomatic setbacks. It is measured in dollars. Dollars that come out of household budgets every single week. And that creates a kind of pressure that foreign policy rarely faces. Domestic pressure, the kind that shifts elections. There is debate over whether this was anticipated. Some reports suggest that regional allies initially preferred a different approach, targeted strikes rather than prolonged economic strangulation. The logic, according to some analysts, was straightforward. Keep Iran economically weakened, but avoid the price volatility that a full blockade would trigger. That option was not chosen. And now, according to critics, the situation has created a paradox. The blockade is meant to weaken Iran, but it may also be weakening the domestic political coalition that supports the broader strategy. Meanwhile, 13 American bases in the region have reportedly been damaged or destroyed. The infrastructure of projection is eroding, and the adversary shows no sign of capitulating. Some defense analysts call this a stalemate. Others use a different word, quagmire. The historical parallel is uncomfortable. In 1953, after the blockade failed, the United States helped install a new government in Tehran. It received 40% ownership in what became British Petroleum. For 2 decades, that arrangement held. Then, it collapsed, and the aftermath shaped the next 50 years of Middle Eastern politics. Some historians argue the current confrontation carries echoes of that era. A confident intervention, an underestimation of local resilience, and consequences that outlast the original strategy by generations. There is also a regional dimension that complicates the picture. Arab states in the Gulf have their own concerns. Some observers suggest they fear instability more than they fear Iran. Others point to anxiety about a shifting balance of power, a vacuum that might be filled in ways they do not control. And then there is the question of what comes next. Proponents of the current approach argue that pressure will eventually work, that economic isolation, sustained long enough, breaks any regime. Critics counter that this assumes Iran has no alternatives, no partners willing to buy its oil through backdoor channels, no allies interested in counterbalancing American influence. Some analysts point to growing coordination between Tehran and Beijing. Others downplay its significance. But the possibility alone introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty, in markets and in politics, has a cost of its own. The current vice president has been described in some polls as historically unpopular. Whether that reflects this specific conflict or broader factors is disputed. But it suggests the political ground is not stable, and unstable ground makes long commitments difficult. What began as a show of strength may be evolving into something else, a test of endurance, not just for Iran, for the domestic coalition that sustains the strategy. Some observers now ask a question that would have seemed unlikely a few months ago. Who blinks first? The answer may not come from Tehran. It may come from gas stations and grocery aisles and midterm ballots, because in the end, foreign policy does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a democracy, and democracies have a way of reevaluating commitments when the cost becomes personal. The blockade continues, but so does the clock.